The morning of September 12, 1942, at Charter Towers Airfield in Queensland, Australia, was already blistering as heat shimmered off the tarmac while a Douglas A-20 Havoc light bomber rolled toward a makeshift hangar built from corrugated tin and hard-won optimism. Inside that hangar, a 43-year-old man with grease-darkened hands and a fierce look in his eyes was on the verge of altering the course of the Pacific War. His name was Paul Irvin Gunn. Everyone called him Pappy. In 6 hours, the plane he had modified would strike a Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea. If his alterations held up, American bombers might finally possess the bite needed to rip into Japanese shipping and shore positions. If they failed, men would die, and the inventive old pilot would be remembered as a fool who squandered precious time and resources on a harebrained scheme. But Pappy Gunn was not dwelling on the possibility of failure. His thoughts were with his wife and 4 children, held 1,700 miles to the north in a Japanese internment camp at Sto Thomas in Manila. He was also thinking about the convoy of Japanese transports he had watched slip past American forces the previous week, because no aircraft could fly low enough, slow enough, and hit hard enough to stop them. He imagined how a medium bomber, originally meant to release ordnance from 12,000 feet, might be refashioned into something the Japanese had never seen before. He pictured a low-level strafing behemoth capable of shredding ships, suppressing anti-aircraft batteries, and turning enemy airfields into grave sites. This is not a tale of cutting-edge technology solving a military problem. It is the story of a blacksmith's son from Arkansas who, armed only with wrecked fighters, simple hand tools, and a desperate drive to free his family, converted America's medium bombers into the most feared gunships in the Pacific. This is the account of improvisation triumphing over formal engineering, of necessity giving birth to an invention that would redefine close air support for generations, and of how one man's rage transformed aluminum and mounted guns into a weapon that helped break the Japanese Empire. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. The North American B-25 Mitchell was never intended to be a gunship. When it left the North American Aviation Plant in Inglewood, California in 1941, it was designed as a medium bomber, a dependable workhorse meant to carry substantial bomb loads economically and accurately from moderate altitudes between about 8,000 and 12,000 feet. Twin Wright R2600 engines, 64 feet from nose to tail, 95-foot wingspan, loaded weight around 33,000 pounds, top speed near 230 miles per hour, range roughly 2,300 miles. The Mitchell was a solid, dependable airplane named for Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell, the charismatic air power prophet who had demonstrated in 1921 that aircraft could sink battleships. It carried a crew of 6, pilot, co-pilot, bombardier navigator, radio operator, and 2 gunners. Its defensive armament included a tail gun, a dorsal turret, and a ventral gun tray that took almost a minute to lower, plenty of time for an attacking Zero to make 3 runs. Those waist guns threatened the Mitchell's own vertical tails and engine nacelles almost as much as they threatened enemy fighters. The aircraft was conventional, well-tested, and utterly unsuited to the kind of fighting unfolding across the Southwest Pacific in 1942. In the jungles and islands of New Guinea and the Solomons, altitude was a luxury bomber crews rarely enjoyed. The jungle terrain and canopy robbed medium-level bombing of much of its effectiveness. From 10,000 feet, a bombardier might spot a ship, an airstrip, or a supply dump, but actually hitting a target through dense foliage while under anti-aircraft fire and harried by Zeros was a different matter. Bombs released from high altitude scattered. Many fell into the jungle and failed to detonate, while others plunged harmlessly into water. The few bombs that did strike often caused only limited damage because they lacked the precision to hit critical points. Meanwhile, Japanese supply convoys ran at night, sustaining isolated garrisons, reinforcing threatened positions, and moving troops and equipment across their vast Pacific domain. American submarines inflicted damage, but they could not be everywhere at once. The U.S. Air Army forces needed a way to hammer those convoys from the air and deny the Japanese the freedom of movement geography seemed to grant them. What they needed were aircraft that could fly low, loiter over targets, suppress defensive fire, and deliver brutal, accurate attacks on ships and shore installations. The problem, in mid-1942, was that no aircraft in the American inventory combined all those qualities. Fighters like the P-40 Warhawk and the P-39 Airacobra had the speed and agility for low-level strikes, but lacked the range, firepower, and survivability for sustained attacks on well-defended targets. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were built for high-altitude strategic missions, not for close-in ship-busting. Light bombers such as the Douglas A-20 Havoc showed promise, but were scarce. The B-25 Mitchell was becoming available in larger numbers, yet it had been built for a wholly different mission profile. What the 5th Air Forces needed was an aircraft that married the range and payload of a medium bomber with the forward-firing firepower of a fighter. They needed an aircraft that could skim the sea at wave-top height, lay down withering streams of heavy machine gun fire to suppress anti-aircraft batteries, and then either shred a target with strafing runs or skip-bomb 500-pound bombs so low they would skip across the water like stones and slam into a ship's hull below the waterline. They needed a gunship, and they needed it in weeks, not months or years. Every week of delay meant more Japanese supply runs, more reinforced positions, and more American and Australian soldiers dying on jungle battlefields where close air support was the difference between survival and annihilation. Into that urgent need stepped Major General George C. Kenney, who arrived in Australia in August 1942 to take command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney was 53, a First World War veteran with no patience for orthodoxy when orthodoxy was getting his men killed. He toured his scattered bases looking for practical fixes to the tactical problems that were bleeding his bomber force white. At Charters Towers Airfield, south of Townsville in Queensland, he found something that caught his attention. In a tin shelter, a greasy, weathered former Navy pilot in his early 40s was working on a Douglas A-20 Havoc, converting the light bomber into something else entirely. Paul Irvin Gunn, known to everyone as Pappy because at 43 he was ancient by Air Force standards, was nothing like the officers Kenney was used to meeting. Gunn had joined the Navy in 1918, spent 21 years as an aviation mechanic and naval aviation pilot, and retired as a chief petty officer in December 1939. He was an expert at low-level flying, a gifted mechanic who understood aircraft the way a blacksmith understands iron, able to shape them with his hands. After leaving the Navy, he moved his family to the Philippines and helped start Philippine Airlines, flying 5 privately owned Beechcraft on cargo and passenger routes across the islands. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Gunn was in Manila. Major General Louis Breton, commander of the Far East Air Force, immediately requisitioned Philippine Airlines planes and crews. Gunn was sworn into the Army Air Corps as a captain, put in charge of an improvised air transport squadron, and ordered to evacuate military personnel from Japanese-held areas. For the next 6 weeks, Gunn flew mission after mission into hostile airspace in unarmed, unarmored Beechcraft,
ferrying out pilots, bringing supplies to besieged troops on Bataan, and performing feats of low-level flying that earned him a reputation as either the bravest or the craziest pilot in the Philippines. He survived being shot down once, crashing into a coconut plantation and being rescued by the plantation owner, someone he had flown as a passenger in peacetime. In late January 1942, he flew one of the last planes out of the Philippines to Australia, carrying key personnel to safety. But he left his family behind. His wife, Clara Louise, and their 4 children, Nathaniel, Connie, Julie, and Paul Jr., were trapped in Manila when the city fell on January 20, 1942. The Japanese rounded up American and Allied civilians and interned them at the University of Santo Tomas. Pappy Gunn's family would remain prisoners there for 3 years, living on starvation rations and under brutal discipline, slowly wasting away while he fought in Australia. Unable to reach or protect them, only able to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy in the desperate hope that ending the war sooner might save their lives. This was the man General Kenny found working on an A-20 in a tin shelter in August 1942. When Kenny asked what he was doing, Gunn explained he was installing 4 .5 caliber machine guns in the bombardier's nose, replacing the transparent plexiglass with solid metal, and converting the light bomber into something else entirely. Kenny asked where the guns had come from. Gunn said he was scavenging them from wrecked fighters scattered across Australian airfields, P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras damaged beyond repair but with serviceable weapons. The 5th Air Force's supply of .5 caliber machine guns was severely limited throughout the Southwest Pacific. There were never enough to go around. So Gunn did what any good mechanic would do. He improvised. He hunted wrecks, salvaged guns, fabricated mounts, tested, adjusted, and tested again until it worked, because making it work was the only option. General Kenny was impressed. This old sailor grasped something headquarters staff in comfortable offices often did not. War is not won by blindly following procedure, but by solving problems. And the best fixes sometimes come from people who know their tools well enough to bend them to new purposes. Kenny put Gunn on his personal staff as a special projects officer and gave him a simple mandate: convert more aircraft, make them deadlier, and do it quickly. Gunn set to work with a fury that astonished everyone around him. He was more than an engineer fixing a technical problem. He was a father trying to shorten the war to save his family. Every aircraft he modified, every sortie it flew, every Japanese ship sunk or airfield wrecked brought the war closer to Manila and closer to Santo Tomas. Fury is a powerful motivator. Desperation is an even more powerful engineer. By early September 1942, Gunn had converted several A-20s into strafers. The modifications were crude but effective. 4 .5 caliber Browning M2 machine guns mounted in the nose, solid metal panels replacing the bombardier station, and extra ammunition storage.
Bomb racks were altered to carry parachute fragmentation bombs, small explosives fitted with parachutes so the attacking aircraft could clear the blast radius even while flying at ultra-low altitude. The parafrag bombs would drift down gently over enemy airfields and installations, detonating above parked aircraft and fuel dumps and showering them with red-hot shrapnel and white phosphorus that ignited whatever the fragment struck. The converted A-20s were combat tested on September 12, 1942, in a raid against the Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea, and the results surpassed every expectation. Flying at wave-top and tree-top level, the strafers dove in before defenders could react, suppressing anti-aircraft batteries with torrents of 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds, then dropping their parafrag bombs directly over the target. Japanese fighters caught on the ground exploded, fuel dumps blew apart, buildings disintegrated. The lightly built Japanese aircraft, designed for agility and range rather than armor, were shredded by 50-inch bullets traveling at roughly 2,900 feet per second. The strafers pulled up and away, leaving a wake of destruction that resembled the wrath of an angry god. General Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to apply the same approach to the B-25 Mitchell. That posed a much larger challenge. The A-20 was a light bomber, relatively small and comparatively simple to modify. The B-25 was a medium bomber, bigger, more complex, and subject to different aerodynamic and structural limits. Adding heavy guns and ammunition to a nose changed the aircraft's center of gravity and affected its stability and handling. Mounted guns also generated recoil forces that the airframe had to absorb. Converting a bomber built for high-altitude level flight into a machine for low-level strafing runs required accepting risks that no engineer at North American Aviation would have approved. But Pappy Gunn did not answer to North American Aviation, he answered to General Kenny. And General Kenny cared less about what the manual declared possible than what needed to be done. Gunn was assisted by Jack Fox, a North American Aviation technical representative based at Charter Towers. Fox forwarded drawings of Gunn's proposed changes back to the factory in Long Beach, California, but there were too few B-25s in theater to spare any for experimental modifications at first. The first B-25s were required for conventional bombing missions, so Gunn had to wait for more aircraft to arrive before he could begin the conversions that would come to define the Pacific Air War. That waiting was agony. Each day meant more supply runs, more reinforcements, more American soldiers dying in jungle battles, and more time his family spent in internment. Gunn flew combat missions himself to test his A-20 conversions, refine tactics, and prove the concept. He logged more missions than almost anyone else in theater, piling up combat hours and enemy kills and earning 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and ultimately 9 Purple Hearts. Wounded 9 separate times, bleeding in combat, and continuing to fly. By late 1942, B-25 Mitchells began arriving in larger numbers in Australia, and General Kenny authorized Gunn to start the conversion program. With a small team of mechanics, he established a B-25 conversion center at Townsville. The alterations were extensive. Remove the transparent bombardier's nose and replace it with solid metal panels. Install 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns, 4 in the nose and 4 in underwing blisters or fuselage packages. Some aircraft received additional armament. 2 more forward-firing guns in cheek blisters on either side of the nose, bringing forward firepower to 10 or even 12 heavy machine guns. Dorsal turret guns were sometimes synchronized to fire forward with the fixed guns, and some B-25s could bring 14 50-caliber machine guns to bear on a target simultaneously. 14 guns firing at roughly 850 rounds per minute apiece, each round a half-inch armor-piercing projectile, created a combined volume of fire so intense that anything caught inside it simply disintegrated. The conversions were not instantaneous. They required weeks of careful work rather than a single desperate night of jury-rigging. Structural integrity had to be preserved as guns were mounted and mounts reinforced. The weapons needed alignment, testing, and adjustment. Ammunition feeds had to be installed and debugged. Pilots had to learn new tactics for aircraft that now handled differently, heavier in the nose and demanding altered flying techniques to compensate for the added weight and firepower. But when the results arrived, they were devastating. The first squadron of strafing B-25s was ready for combat in early 1943, and they proved their worth in the most dramatic way possible. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, one of the most lopsided victories in naval aviation history, Pappy Gunn's jury-rigged gunships would demonstrate beyond any doubt that they had changed the Pacific War forever. In early March 1943, intelligence reached General Kenny's headquarters in Port Moresby that a Japanese convoy was assembling at Rabaul, New Guinea. 8 transports carrying nearly 7,000 troops, escorted by 8 destroyers, bound for Lae, New Guinea, where Japanese forces were under pressure from Allied advances. The convoy represented a massive reinforcement, enough troops to alter the ground campaign and enough supplies to sustain resistance for months. General Kenny knew what had to be done. The convoy had to be destroyed. Every ship, every soldier, every ton of supplies. Not merely damaged or delayed. If those 7,000 troops reached Leh, American and Australian forces would pay in blood on jungle battlefields where the enemy already exploited every advantage terrain could offer. They had to have an airplane that could fly at wave-top height, lay down relentless streams of heavy machine gun fire to silence anti-aircraft batteries, and then either shred a target with strafing runs or skip-bomb 500-pound bombs so low that they would bounce across the sea like stones and slam into a hull below the waterline. They needed a gunship, and they needed it within weeks, not months or years. Every week of delay meant more Japanese supply runs, more reinforced positions, and more American and Australian soldiers dying in jungle battles where close air support meant the difference between survival and annihilation. Into that urgency stepped Major General George C. Kenney, who arrived in Australia in August 1942 to assume command of Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific. Kenney was 53, a First World War veteran with no tolerance for doctrine that cost lives. He toured his scattered bases searching for practical answers to the tactical problems that were draining his bomber force. At Charters Towers airfield south of Townsville in Queensland, he found something that stopped him in his tracks. A greasy, weathered former Navy pilot in his early 40s was working in a tin shelter on a Douglas A-20 Havoc, converting the light bomber into something else entirely. Paul Irvin Gunn, known as Pappy because at 43 he was ancient by Air Force standards, was nothing like the officers Kenney typically met. Gunn had enlisted in the Navy in 1918, spent 21 years as an aviation mechanic and naval aviator, and retired as a chief petty officer in December 1939. He was an expert in low-level flying, a gifted mechanic who understood aircraft the way a blacksmith understands iron, able to shape them with his hands. After leaving the Navy, he moved his family to the Philippines and helped found Philippine Airlines, flying 5 privately owned Beechcraft on cargo and passenger routes across the islands. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Gunn was in Manila. Major General Louis Brereton, commander of the Far East Air Force, immediately requisitioned Philippine Airlines planes and crews. Gunn was sworn into the Army Air Forces as a captain, placed in charge of an improvised air transport squadron, and ordered to evacuate military personnel from Japanese-held territory. For 6 weeks, Gunn flew mission after mission into hostile airspace in unarmed, unarmored Beechcraft, ferrying out pilots, bringing supplies to besieged troops on Bataan, and performing feats of low-level flying that earned him a reputation as either the bravest or the craziest pilot in the Philippines. He survived being shot down once, crashing into a coconut plantation and being rescued by the plantation owner, someone he had flown as a passenger in peacetime. In late January 1942, he flew one of the last aircraft out of the Philippines to Australia, carrying key personnel to safety, but he left his family behind. His wife, Clarissa Louise, and their 4 children, Nathaniel, Connie, Julie, and Paul Jr., were trapped in Manila when the city fell. On January 20, 1942, the Japanese rounded up American and Allied civilians and interned them at the University of Santo Tomas. Pappy Gunn's family would remain prisoners there for 3 years, living on starvation rations and under brutal discipline, slowly wasting away while he fought in Australia, unable to reach or protect them, only able to inflict as much damage as possible on the enemy in the desperate hope that ending the war sooner might save their lives. This was the man Kenney found working on an A-20 in a tin shelter in August 1942. When Kenney asked what he was doing, Gunn explained he was fitting 4 50-caliber machine guns into the bombardier's nose, replacing the transparent plexiglass with solid metal and turning the light bomber into something else entirely. Kenney asked where Gunn had obtained the guns. Gunn answered that he scavenged them from wrecked fighters scattered across Australian airfields, P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras damaged beyond repair but with serviceable weapons. The 5th Air Force's supply of 50-caliber guns was painfully limited throughout the Southwest Pacific. There were never enough.
So Gunn improvised. He hunted wrecks, salvaged guns, fabricated mounts, tested, adjusted, and tested again until it worked, because making it work was the only available option. Kenny was impressed. This old sailor understood something headquarters staff in comfortable offices often did not. War is not won by rigid procedure, but by solving problems, and the best solutions sometimes come from people who know their tools well enough to bend them to new purposes. Kenny placed Gunn on his personal staff as a special projects officer and gave him a simple order: convert more aircraft, make them deadlier, and do it fast. Gunn attacked the job with a fury that astonished everyone around him. He was more than an engineer fixing a technical issue. He was a father trying to shorten the war and save his family. Every aircraft he converted and every sortie it flew, every Japanese ship sunk or airfield wrecked, brought the war closer to Manila and closer to Santo Tomas. Fury and desperation proved potent motivators. By early September 1942, Gunn had converted several A-20s into strafers. The modifications were crude but effective. 4 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns mounted in the nose, solid metal panels replacing the bombardier's transparent station, and extra ammunition storage. Bomb racks were altered to carry parachute fragmentation bombs, small explosives fitted with parachutes so the attacking aircraft could clear the blast radius even while flying at ultra-low altitude. These parafrag bombs floated down over enemy airfields and installations, detonating above parked aircraft and fuel dumps and showering them with red-hot fragments and white phosphorus that ignited whatever the fragments struck. The converted A-20s were combat-tested on September 12, 1942, in a raid against the Japanese airfield at Buna, New Guinea, with results that surpassed every expectation. Flying at wave-top and tree-top level, the strafers dove in before defenders could react, suppressed anti-aircraft batteries with torrents of 50 caliber armor-piercing rounds, and then released their parafrag bombs directly over targets. Japanese fighters caught on the ground exploded. Fuel dumps detonated, buildings disintegrated. The lightly built Japanese planes, designed for agility and range, not for armor, were shredded by half-inch bullets traveling at roughly 2,900 feet per second. The strafers pulled up and away, leaving a trail of destruction that looked like the wrath of an angry god. Kenny immediately ordered Gunn to apply the same treatment to the B-25 Mitchell. That presented a larger challenge. The A-20 was a light bomber, small and relatively easy to modify. The B-25 was a medium bomber, larger, more complex, and subject to different aerodynamic and structural constraints. Adding mass to the nose changed the aircraft's center of gravity and affected its stability and handling. Mounted guns generated recoil forces the airframe had to absorb. Converting a bomber designed for high-altitude level flight into a low-level strafing platform required accepting risks no engineer at North American Aviation would have approved. But Pappy Gunn answered to Kenny, not to the factory. Kenny did not care whether the manual said something was possible. He cared about what needed to be done. Gunn was assisted by Jack Fox, a North American Aviation technical representative at Charters Towers, who forwarded drawings of Gunn's proposed modifications back to the Long Beach factory. Yet there were too few B-25s in theater to spare any for experimental conversions at first. The early B-25s were required for conventional bombing missions, so Gunn had to wait for more aircraft to arrive before he could begin the large-scale modifications that would come to define the Pacific Air War. That waiting was agony. Every day meant more supply runs, more reinforcements, and more casualties, and more time his family remained in internment. Gunn continued to fly combat missions himself to test his A-20 conversions, refine tactics, and prove the concept. He flew more missions than almost anyone in theater, piling up combat hours and enemy kills and earning 2 distinguished flying crosses, the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, the Air Medal, and ultimately 9 Purple Hearts, wounded 9 times yet continuing to fly. By late 1942, B-25 Mitchells were arriving in greater numbers in Australia, and Kenny authorized Gunn to begin the conversion program. With a small team of mechanics, Gunn established a B-25 conversion center in Townsville. The modifications were extensive. The transparent bombardier's nose was removed and replaced with solid metal. 8 Browning M250 caliber machine guns were installed, 4 in the nose and 4 in underwing blisters or fuselage packages. Some aircraft received additional guns, 2 more forward-firing weapons in cheek blisters on either side of the nose, bringing forward firepower to 10 or even 12 heavy machine guns. Dorsal turret guns were sometimes synchronized to fire forward with the fixed weapons, and some B-25s could bring as many as 14 50 caliber machine guns to bear on a target simultaneously. 14 guns, each capable of firing roughly 850 rounds per minute or about 200 rounds per second, produced a volume of fire so dense, nearly 11,900 rounds per minute or about 200 rounds per second, that anything caught within it simply disintegrated. The conversions took weeks rather than a single desperate night of jury rigging. Structural reinforcement was required where guns were mounted.
The conversions took weeks rather than a single desperate night of jury rigging. Structural reinforcement was required where guns were mounted. Weapons had to be aligned, tested, and adjusted. Ammunition feed systems had to be installed and debugged. Pilots had to learn new tactics for aircraft that now handled differently, nose-heavy and demanding altered flying techniques to compensate for the added weight and firepower. When the results finally arrived, they were devastating. The first squadron of strafing B-25s was ready for combat in early 1943 and would prove its worth in the most dramatic way imaginable. In the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, one of the most one-sided victories in naval aviation history, Gunn's jury-rigged gunships demonstrated beyond doubt that they had changed the Pacific War. In early March 1943, intelligence reached Kenny's headquarters in Port Moresby. A Japanese convoy was assembling at Rabaul. 8 transports carrying nearly 7,000 troops, escorted by 8 destroyers, bound for Lae, New Guinea, where Japanese forces faced pressure from Allied advances. The convoy represented a massive reinforcement effort, enough soldiers to alter the ground campaign, and enough supplies to sustain resistance for months. Kenny knew what had to be done. He had the aircraft to do it. B-17 Flying Fortresses for high-altitude bombing, B-25 Mitchells, some still conventional and others already converted into Pappy Gunn strafers, A-20 Havocs, similarly modified, and P-38 Lightning fighters for escort and strafing. He also had a tactic tested in smaller fights but never against a force this large, well-defended, and important: skip bombing. The concept was simple in theory and terrifying in practice. A bomber approached at extremely low altitude, 200 feet or less, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the waves. At point-blank range, perhaps a quarter-mile from the target, the bomber released its bombs with a slight upward trajectory. The bombs skipped across the water like flat stones, except these stones weighed 500 pounds and carried high explosives. They might skip once or twice, then slam into the ship's hull at or below the waterline, exactly where naval architects know a vessel is most vulnerable. The explosion opened the hull to the sea, the ship flooded and sank. But skip bombing required pilots to fly directly at heavily armed warships through walls of anti-aircraft fire, low enough that a single mistake meant hitting the water and disintegrating, slow enough for enemy gunners to aim, and close enough that a premature detonation could trap the attacking aircraft in its own blast. It demanded nerves of steel and perfect timing, and it required aircraft capable of suppressing anti-aircraft fire long enough for the bomber to release its ordnance and escape. It required Pappy Gunn's Strafer B-25s. On March 2, 1943, the convoy departed Rabaul and steamed southwest through the Solomon Sea toward Lae, New Guinea. Australian reconnaissance planes spotted and shadowed the convoy, reporting its position and course, and Kenny mobilized his air groups. Bombers and fighters took off from bases across New Guinea and northern Australia. The weather was terrible: heavy clouds, rain squalls, and poor visibility. But this worked to the Allies' advantage, allowing aircraft to approach unseen until the last moment. The initial attacks were conventional. B-17 Flying Fortresses bombed from altitude on March 2nd and 3rd, scoring few hits but forcing the convoy to maneuver and slowing its progress. Then, when the weather cleared on the morning of March 3rd, Kenny unleashed the strafers.
The modified B-25s and A-20s came in so low their propellers churned spray from the wave tops. They approached in formation like a wall of aircraft bearing down on the convoy at high speed. The Japanese ships saw them, and anti-aircraft batteries opened up. 20mm and 25mm cannons sent up walls of explosive shells. Heavier 40mm guns pumped rounds on arcing trajectories. The sky filled with tracer fire, black puffs of exploding shells, smoke, and the fury of desperate defense. Then the strafers opened fire. Multiple aircraft attacking simultaneously, each bringing a hail of .5 caliber rounds to bear. Thousands of rounds per second hammered into Japanese ships.
The effect was apocalyptic. Anti-aircraft gun crews were cut down where they stood. Gun shields were perforated like paper. Bridge windows shattered and superstructures were shredded. Armor-piercing rounds punched through light plating, ricocheted off bulkheads, tore through wooden structures, started fires, and detonated ammunition. Surviving Japanese gunners found themselves suppressed and unable to aim, forced to take cover as half-inch bullets tore apart everything around them. In that window of suppressed fire, the skip-bombing B-25s and conventional Mitchells released their loads. 500-pound bombs skipped across the water. Some missed, war is never perfect, but many hit. They struck holes below the waterline and exploded with the force of half a ton of high explosive concentrated against the weakest part of a ship's structure. Steel plates buckled, welds failed, and the sea poured in. Transport ships, heavily laden with troops and supplies, were especially vulnerable. They lacked armored hulls and sophisticated damage control, and when hulls opened, they began sinking immediately. Troops below decks, trapped in flooding compartments, had nowhere to go. Ships listed, capsized, or broke apart and slid beneath the waves. The destroyers fared better, designed to take punishment, but even they could not withstand the coordinated assault. One destroyer took a bomb amidships and broke in half. Another was so badly raked by 50 caliber fire that it became unmanageable, drifting in circles as fires raged. A third destroyer, attempting to rescue survivors from a sinking transport, was caught by strafers and turned into a funeral pyre. The battle raged for 3 days. Every time the Japanese tried to rescue survivors, Allied aircraft appeared. Every time a damaged ship tried to limp away, it was attacked again. The strafer B-25s hunted like coordinated wolves, working with conventional bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft that spotted targets. They used the new parachute fragmentation bombs to float explosives down over decks of transports and destroyers, killing exposed personnel, starting fires, and creating chaos. They strafed lifeboats and debris fields not out of cruelty, but because those survivors were soldiers, who, if rescued, would fight again on New Guinea's battlefields. By March 4th, the fighting was over. The results were staggering. All 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers sunk, and 3 others heavily damaged. Approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers were killed in the sinkings or in the water. Fewer than 1,000 reached land, and most of those were immediately captured or killed by Allied forces. The reinforcement effort was annihilated. The supplies meant to sustain the Japanese garrison at lay at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Allied losses were comparatively light. 4 aircraft shot down, and 13 aircrew killed or missing. It was one of the most one-sided victories in modern warfare. At the center of that success were Pappy Gunn's modified B-25s, the strafers that suppressed defensive fire and made skip bombing possible, tearing Japanese ships apart with concentrated machine gun fire. Kenny immediately ordered more conversions.
Word of the success spread quickly across the Pacific. Other air forces wanted the strafers. The 13th Air Force sent its B-25s to Brisbane for conversion. Depot engineers at Tantuata began modifying aircraft, and the 10th Air Force in India soon adopted the same changes. What had started as one man's desperate improvisation in a tin hangar in Queensland became standard practice throughout the Pacific theater. But the story didn't end with tactical triumph. Back in California, engineers at North American Aviation were paying close attention. Factory representatives had been sending detailed reports on Gunn's field modifications, and engineers in Long Beach were studying the results. They began integrating his innovations into new production models. In late 1943, North American rolled out the B-25G. The transparent nose was gone, replaced by a solid metal housing that mounted a 75mm M4 cannon, a tank gun fitted to an aircraft. It fired 3-pound high-explosive shells capable of striking ships 2 miles away and sinking smaller vessels with a single hit. 4.50 caliber machine guns supplemented the cannon. The concept was bold, but the execution was difficult. The 75mm cannon produced massive recoil. Every shot caused the entire aircraft to shudder violently. Pilots struggled to maintain control. The gun had to be loaded by hand, was slow to reload, and ran out of ammunition quickly. After 7 weeks of combat, squadrons flying the cannon-armed B-25Gs had expended all their 75mm shells. The cannon-equipped Mitchells proved to be an intriguing experiment, but ultimately less effective than Pappy Gunn's simpler and more reliable solution, more machine guns. The next version, the B-25H, appeared soon after, with about 1,000 aircraft produced. It mounted 14.50 caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in fuselage gun packs, and 2 in the dorsal turret. And some models even carried 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets that could be fired in devastating salvos. The ultimate expression of Pappy Gunn's vision came with the B-25J, introduced in 1944. North American built over 4,000 of them. Many rolled off the line with transparent noses for conventional bombing, but air depots offered conversion kits to fit a strafer nose instead. Once converted, a B-25J strafer carried 18.50 caliber machine guns, 8 in the nose, 4 in fuselage gun packs, 2 in the dorsal turret, 1 in each waist position, and 2 in the tail. 14 of those 18 guns fired forward. Together, they produced a combined rate of fire of 15,300 rounds per minute, over 250 rounds every second. A B-25J strafer firing all its forward guns put more lead into the air than an entire infantry company with rifles. The result on targets wasn't simply destruction, it was annihilation. These heavily armed Mitchells ravaged Japanese positions across New Guinea, the Philippines, and Okinawa until the end of the war. They strafed airfields, destroyed parked aircraft, cut supply lines by attacking bridges, hunted barges and small ships, and delivered devastating close air support. They were so effective that captured Japanese documents warned troops not to engage when strafers were overhead, claiming weapons were useless against them and that firing back would only anger the monsters. The strafer crews developed their own daring tactics and earned a fierce reputation. They flew low enough to see the fear on enemy soldiers' faces, attacked from unexpected angles, over mountains, through valleys, along coastlines, using the terrain to mask their approach until the last second. They coordinated with precision, one aircraft laying suppression fire while another delivered the killing strike. They were feared, hated, and utterly merciless. And behind every one of those planes was Pappy Gunn's desperate fury, transformed into engineering genius and lethal innovation. Major Gunn, promoted for his achievements and combat record, was eventually sent back to the United States to oversee factory production of the new B-25 variants at North American Aviation. It was an acknowledgement that his field modifications had revolutionized bomber warfare. But Gunn didn't want recognition. He wanted to fight. He wanted to keep killing Japanese soldiers and end the war that had imprisoned his family. He returned to the Pacific as soon as he could, continuing to fly combat missions and take risks that made his commanders uneasy. In late 1944, during a Japanese bombing raid on Leyte in the Philippines, he was caught on the ground and badly wounded, his 9th Purple Heart. The injury forced him out of active combat. By then, however, his strafer program was so deeply integrated into Pacific air operations that it no longer needed him. In February 1945, American forces liberated Manila
after brutal house-to-house fighting against Japanese troops who refused to surrender. On February 3rd, American soldiers reached the University of Santo Tomas and found over 3,000 internees, starving, sick, and broken from 3 years of captivity. Among them were Clara Louise Gunn and her 4 children. After years of separation and unimaginable hardship, Pappy Gunn was finally reunited with his family.
They were alive, barely, malnourished, traumatized, and forever scarred by their ordeal, but alive. The war he had fought to shorten, the modifications he had made, the missions he had flown, the Japanese he had killed, all of it had been for this moment. His family had survived. The Philippines were free. The war was nearing its end. Paul Irvin Pappy Gunn retired from the U.S. Army Air Forces as a full colonel on June 30, 1948, medically discharged after years of accumulated wounds. He returned to the Philippines to help rebuild Philippine Airlines, the same company he had helped found before the war. The airline grew rapidly, expanding routes across the South Pacific and becoming one of the region's major carriers. Gunn was back in the cockpit again, not as a combat pilot, but as a civilian aviator, carrying passengers and cargo instead of guns and fury. On October 11, 1957, tragedy struck when his chartered Beech 18 went down in a storm over the Philippines. He was 57 years old. He had survived 21 years in the Navy, 5 years of brutal combat in the Pacific, 9 combat wounds, countless close calls, and the loss of nearly everything he loved during the years his family was imprisoned. In the end, it was a storm over the islands he cherished that claimed his life. But his legacy endured. The strafer concept he pioneered did not die with him. During the Korean War, modified B-25s provided close air support using the very same low-level attack tactics Gunn had invented. His principle, that a heavily armed, stable platform delivering concentrated firepower could be a decisive weapon, became doctrine. In the 1960s, as the United States developed new gunships for the Vietnam War, engineers studied Pappy Gunn's work. They recognized his insight. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the most advanced or sophisticated, but the one that delivers the most firepower exactly where it's needed. The AC-47 Spooky, the first modern gunship, fired sideways instead of forward and used a circular pylon turn, but it shared the same core idea, that transport and bomber aircraft could be transformed into devastating gun platforms. The AC-130 Spectre, still flying decades later with 105mm howitzers and precision targeting systems, is a direct descendant of Pappy Gunn's vision. Every Air Force close air support doctrine written since the 1940s implicitly or explicitly acknowledges that Pappy Gunn was right, that desperation can drive innovation, that field modifications can outpace factory design, and that the side willing to improvise, to bend rules, and to transform its tools into new weapons gains an advantage that technology alone can never provide. The irony of his story runs deep. A bomber originally designed for medium-altitude bombing became one of the deadliest low-level strafers in history. A retired Navy pilot running a civilian airline became one of World War II's most inventive weapons designers. An improvised modification program built from scavenged parts and desperation became the foundation of gunship doctrine for the next 80 years. A man fighting to save his family helped destroy an empire. And perhaps the greatest irony of all, the B-25 Mitchell, the aircraft that Pappy Gunn so dramatically transformed, was never meant for close air support. It was supposed to drop bombs from medium altitude, safe, conventional, predictable. But orthodoxy doesn't win wars. Innovation does. Desperation does. Fury,
when harnessed through love and necessity, becomes its own kind of genius. On the morning of September 12, 1942, when Pappy Gunn's modified A-20 struck the Japanese airfield at Buna, the raid exceeded every expectation. But Gunn wasn't celebrating. He was already planning the next change, the next improvement, the next innovation. Every day the war continued was another day his family languished in captivity. Every mission his aircraft flew, every Japanese position his designs destroyed, brought the end closer. War is often told as a tale of great generals, grand strategy, and decisive battles. But wars are also won in hot, improvised hangars in the Australian outback, by middle-aged mechanics with grease on their hands and fury in their hearts. By men who understand that sometimes victory depends on asking a simple question about a perfectly good aircraft. What if we added more guns? Pappy Gunn asked that question. He answered it with a wrench, a welder, and unrelenting determination. And the Japanese Empire paid the price in blood and steel at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. The B-25 Mitchell flew in every theater of World War II, from the Doolittle raid on Tokyo to bombing runs over Europe, Africa, and Asia. Nearly 10,000 were built, serving in dozens of air forces worldwide. It was dependable, adaptable, and beloved by its crews. But in the jungles and islands of the Southwest Pacific, it became something more. It became a gunship, a ship killer, a weapon so terrifying that the Japanese were forced to abandon daylight convoys, scatter their supply lines, and accept that American air power could find them anywhere, anytime, and turn their ships into burning wrecks. All of it, the tactics, the conversions, the victories, traced back to one man who refused to accept defeat, who refused to believe his family's captivity was inevitable, and who refused to believe that aircraft must always be used as their designers intended. Pappy Gunn did not invent the gunship in a single flash of inspiration. He built it through relentless trial and error, through combat, through engineering intuition, through pain and urgency. He did it faster than any official program could have. He did it with scavenged parts and improvised tools. He did it because he had to, because every day of delay meant his family's suffering continued. Because fury, when guided by love and necessity, can be the most powerful engineer of all.
The Strafer B-25s were far from perfect. They were nose-heavy and handled differently from standard Mitchells. The recoil from firing all their guns at once was so intense that it could physically slow the plane in flight. Ammunition vanished in seconds of sustained fire, and flying at such low altitudes made the aircraft easy targets for ground gunners. Crews died. Planes were lost. War is never clean, never simple, and never without cost. But the Strafer B-25s worked. They changed the course of the Pacific War. They gave American forces the ability to cut off Japanese supply lines, to support ground troops with devastating precision, and to obliterate enemy positions before defenders could react. They saved lives, American, Australian, and Allied, by shortening battles, preventing reinforcements from reaching garrisons, and providing the kind of close air support that turned defeat into victory. And every time a Strafer B-25 dove toward a Japanese ship or airfield, every time 14 machine guns roared in unison and a target disintegrated under their concentrated fire, it was Pappy Gunn's fury made manifest. It was a father's desperation turned into engineering. It was improvisation triumphing over orthodoxy. It was proof that sometimes the greatest solutions emerge not from careful design, but from having no other choice. The Pacific War ended on August 15, 1945, with Japan's surrender. Pappy Gunn's family was finally free, The Strafer B-25s had played their part in bringing that day closer. How much closer is impossible to measure, but every ship they sank, every airfield they destroyed, every battle they shortened added to the mounting pressure that forced Japan to accept the unacceptable. Wars are won by many forces: strategy, logistics, production, courage, sacrifice, but also by individuals who see a problem and refuse to leave it unsolved, who take ordinary tools and make them extraordinary. Pappy Gunn was one of those people. His legacy was not a single decisive moment, but hundreds of modifications, thousands of sorties, and tens of thousands of enemy casualties inflicted by aircraft he had transformed. The B-25 Mitchell was already a good aeroplane. Pappy Gunn made it a great one, not through sophisticated engineering or advanced technology, but by asking the simplest, most practical question: what does this aircraft need to do the job that must be done? The answer was obvious to him: more guns, more forward-firing heavy machine guns that could suppress enemy fire and obliterate targets with overwhelming power. So he added them, with wrenches and welding torches, with scavenged parts and improvised mounts, with ingenuity born of desperation and refined through combat. The result changed aerial warfare. 80 years later, the U.S. Air Force still flies gunships built on the same principles Pappy Gunn pioneered. The platforms have changed: turboprop transports instead of piston-engine bombers. The weapons are far more advanced: cannons, howitzers, and precision-guided munitions. Targeting is done with radar, infrared, and computers that would have seemed like science fiction in 1942. But the core insight remains: a transport or bomber, properly modified, can deliver sustained, devastating firepower against ground targets with unmatched precision and endurance. Every AC-130 gunship pilot owes a debt to Pappy Gunn. Every close air support controller calling for fire from a circling gunship uses tactics born over New Guinea and the Bismarck Sea. And every innovation in airborne firepower stands on the foundation he built in a tin hangar in Queensland, working with hand tools and raw determination. This is not the story of advanced technology crushing an unsophisticated foe. The Japanese were not primitive. Their aircraft were excellent, their ships well-armed, their pilots skilled and brave. They understood war as well as anyone. But they did not have Pappy Gunn, the blacksmith's son from Arkansas who knew airplanes well enough to reshape them, who was desperate enough to try what others would not, and who worked 18-hour days modifying bombers because every hour of delay was another hour his family remained imprisoned. The Japanese fought with skill and courage. They fought with everything they had, but they could not adapt as fast as Pappy Gunn could innovate. They could not counter tactics they had never imagined. And when those Strafer B-25s came in low over the waves, guns blazing, bombs skipping across the water toward their hulls, no amount of courage or training could save them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, explore the other videos on your screen, and don't forget to subscribe.